So our third speaker is Deacon John Traveling, MD. Dr. John Traveling earned his medical degree from Jefferson Medical College, completed his residency in internal medicine at the University of Maryland, and then completed a fellowship in pulmonary critical care at Temple University. His interest in Christian ethics began when he was a graduate student of religious studies at Villanova University. He served on the ethics committee at University of Maryland and was the chair of the ethics committee at Temple University from 1994 until 2004. He has been a regular contributor to the National Catholic Bioethics Quarterly and serves as the executive editor for the Lineker Quarterly. He has published over 120 articles, including publications on medical ethics, physician-patient communication, end-of-life care, and selected areas in theology. He currently is professor of thoracic medicine and surgery at the Lewis Katz School of Medicine at Temple University. In addition, Dr. Traveling was ordained deacon for the Archdiocese of Philadelphia in 2012. He has been married for 28 years and has 4 children. The title of his talk is Practicing Medicine in the Light of the Gospel. Please help me welcome Deacon John Traveling, MD.
Thank you. Then the two recounted what had taken place on the way and how he was made known to them in the breaking of the bread. While they were still speaking about this, he stood in their midst and said to them, "Peace be with you." But they were startled and terrified and thought that they were seeing a ghost. Then he said to them, "Why are you troubled? And why do questions arise in your hearts? Look at my hands and my feet, that it is I myself. Touch me and see, because a ghost does not have flesh and bones, as you can see I have." And as he said this, he showed them his hands and his feet. While they were still incredulous for joy and were amazed, he asked them, "Have you anything here to eat?" They gave him a piece of baked fish. He took it and ate it in front of them. There's an old Orthodox Christian story of a monk who one day was in his cell. He was sitting in the dimly lit room. His eyes were closed, and he was deep in prayer. After some time, he opened his eyes, and he saw before him a figure, radiant in appearance, standing triumphantly, robed in majesty, with a face that conveyed compassion, and at the same time, great strength. And the monk cried out, "Jesus!" And then he looked down, closing his eyes once again, and said, "Depart from me." He then lifted his head and opened his eyes and saw that the figure was gone. That figure was Satan. A while later, this monk was telling the other monks what had happened to him. And they asked him, they said, "How did you know? How did you know that it was Satan?" He answered them simply, "Because it had no wounds." We recognize Jesus, the risen Lord, God in our midst, in and by his wounds. Looking at the wounds then in our world, we may recognize Jesus. Aren't we especially privileged as healthcare workers to be in a profession that so often puts us close to the woundedness in others? Before I go on further in this presentation, I want to thank Marie and all of the organizers for this wonderful, engaging, spirit-filled conference. And as it begins to wind down on this final day, I'm going to share with you a perspective of practicing medicine from my personal experience. Hopefully, the joy revealed to us in the gospel and the joy of practicing medicine in an authentic way will be evident. And I will share with you specifically what I think it means to practice in light of the gospel. As such, it will be important for us to hear the gospel. And so throughout this presentation, we'll reflect on a few gospel accounts and hopefully receive some insights as to gospel values that will enrich and inform our practice of medicine. So this talk actually is being co-presented. The major content will be found in the gospel passages, and then I will offer some of my thoughts. In our vulnerability, from the Latin word vulnus, which means wound, in the vulnerability of our patients, in the woundedness of our culture, in the brokenness of humanity, we are sure to find Jesus. And part of the great joy we experience in medicine is the privilege to touch Jesus in the woundedness of others. Mostly the physical and psychological woundedness, but sometimes the spiritual as well. Now, at this point is what I think practicing medicine in light of the gospel is about. And it is directly tied to the joy we are privileged to experience as physicians and healthcare professionals. Now, talking about wounds and brokenness can sound very depressing, very weighty, intense, even gloomy. Yet it is truly a joy to practice in light of the gospel, always mindful as much as we possibly can be throughout the day of God's presence right by our side in our encounters with patients. How is this joyful? Well, with the opportunity to enter into the suffering and brokenness of others, and with others, we have the option to go beyond the suffering, to not be left there in its raw state, but to enter into it, knowing it has been transformed, knowing that in and through suffering, redemption is achieved. And redemption, the passion, death, resurrection of Jesus Christ, is about restoration, healing, and joy. In fact, it's the Easter joy, isn't it? The victory over all that is concerned with death and darkness and despair. Let's reflect on another account, this one from Matthew. When the Son of Man comes in glory, and all the angels with him, then he will sit on his glorious throne. Before him will be gathered all the nations, and he will separate them one from another, as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. And he will place the sheep at his right hand and the goats at the left. Then the king will say to those at his right, "Come, O blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you visited me. I was in prison, and you came to me. And the righteous will answer him, Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you drink? And when did we see you a stranger and welcome you, or naked and clothe you? And when did we see you sick or in prison and visit you? And the king will answer them, truly I say to you, as you did it to one of the least of these my brethren, you did it to me. I don't know about you, but this account always gives me great pause. It is certainly a challenge and always causes me to question myself about whether I recognize Jesus in others as much as I could. And doesn't this familiar account reinforce the command or the call to all of us about love for our neighbor? Doesn't this gospel prompt us to take inventory of our actions toward others? Matthew reminds us that our acts of charity, love, mercy, and compassion are all acts done to Jesus himself. As an aside, I must tell you that I always like this particular translation of the gospel because although subtle, it uses the preposition to, not for. We do these things, or not, to Jesus, not for Jesus, in the sense that might connote on behalf of or connote agency, somehow one step removed from the action to Jesus himself. Is this Jesus? From my personal experience, recently in the office, I was evaluating a homeless man. He was 54 years old, had straggly hair, was poorly clothed, was cachectic, and had metastatic lung cancer. He was too weak to sit upon the exam table in the office, so to examine him, I stood behind him listening to his lungs from the back, and looking down at him, I could not help but image Christ. Another time, while rounding in the hospital when examining a middle-aged woman's feet, while removing and then putting back on the hospital-issued sock slippers that patients receive, I could not help but recall both the foot washing of the apostles by Jesus and the woman washing the feet of Jesus with her tears. Frequently, while rounding in the ICU, as I see patients lying in their hospital bed, connected to a ventilator, maybe with a chest tube in their side, their arms outstretched and catheterized. Again, I can't help but image our crucified Lord Jesus on the cross near the end of his life. Especially when there's a chest tube present, or when I'm placing a chest tube. Invariably, this for me calls to mind the pierced side of Jesus on the cross. And if a chest tube calls to mind the pierced side of Jesus on the cross, what might this resemble? In my world professionally, I spend a lot of time in the ICU, And a number of years ago, I came across the suggestion to view the intensive care unit as a holy place. And to image the ICU as a holy place may be instructive to us as a setting that provides opportunity to reflect where the holy may be found. It may help guide our behavior and actions, especially those to be carried out with particular reverence and respect. Further, the ICU especially is one place where obvious application of medical technology can tend to depersonalize patients, and it is extremely important in our practice of medicine to maintain a strong sense of the primacy of the patient as person. Let's look at this a little more closely again in light of the gospel, and especially after hearing our previous presentation so beautifully done by Dr. Hunt. They came to the other side of the sea, to the country of the Gerasenes. And when he had come out of the boat, there met him out of the tombs a man with an unclean spirit, who lived among the tombs, and no one could bind him anymore, even with a chain. For he had often been bound with shackles and chains, but the chains he wrenched apart, and the shackles he broke in pieces, and no one had the strength to subdue him. Night and day among the tombs and on the mountains, he was always crying out and bruising himself with stones. And when he saw Jesus from afar, he ran and worshipped him. And crying out with a loud voice, he said, "What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I adjure you, by God, do not torment me." For he had said to him, "Come out of the man, you unclean spirit." And Jesus asked him, "What is your name?" He replied, "My name is Legion, for we are many." And he begged him eagerly not to send them out of the country. Now a great herd of swine was feeding there on the hillside, and they begged him, "Send us to the swine, let us to enter them." So he gave them leave, and the unclean spirits came out and entered the swine, and the herd, numbering about 2,000, rushed down the steep bank into the sea and were drowned in the sea. The herdsmen fled and told it in the city and in the country, and people came to see what it was that had happened. And they came to Jesus and saw the demoniac sitting there, clothed and in his right mind, and the man who had had the legion, and they were afraid. Do we encounter patients like this? The difficult patient, the patient that we rather not see, maybe the patient, dare I say, we do not like? The patient who appears to have lost human dignity, the one that no one wants to be around? What about the patient whose condition may be so complicated and perhaps despite innumerable consults and visits to physicians, still has no clear course of effective therapy and continues to decline? Many of us, I'm sure, have encountered this type of patient, the one for whom we say there is nothing more we can do. And if we're honest, we're frustrated and sometimes would rather not see the patient because we think there is nothing more we can offer. Yet, we must encounter that patient. Does this sound familiar? Can we imagine encountering, as Jesus did, the Gerasene demoniac? Now, there's a lot going on in this account from Mark, but one of the salient points I see in the context of medical practice is that of the dignity of the human person. This man is naked, he's out of his mind, he's taken over by demons, lives among the dead. He appears angry and disturbed that Jesus, who he presumably knows is God, is about goodness and truth and healing and restoration. And yet he is trapped, he's shackled, enslaved, imprisoned. And all of these descriptions are apt. And yet, the divine physician breaks through. He restores him to manhood. He commands the unclean spirits to come out of the man. What are the barriers that may prevent us from seeing patients as persons? What tends to dehumanize patients? What are the factors or circumstances that we need to push through or overcome in order to see the patient as the loved son or daughter of our Father? Is it the absence of a patient's family? I too often see patients in the ICU at our hospital many times for days before anyone from the patient's circle of family or friends or acquaintances even notices that the patient is in the hospital. Not infrequently, no one ever comes around. And if the patient survives to be discharged from the hospital, goes back to a socially isolated life alone with little to no meaningful relationships. What about the patient who is surrounded with all sorts of advanced, specialized devices and machines? The patient connected not only to the mechanical ventilator, but continuous dialysis machine, the balloon pump, ECMO, every central line in the vein in the neck and the groin cannulated, not to mention the arterial lines connected to monitors, patient covered with one of these big bear hugger warming blankets. The patient in the middle of all of this is hardly visible to anyone walking into their room. Does all of this tend to depersonalize the patient? How about the patients themselves? Those who may have such a poor view of themselves, perhaps because of their addictions, feeling guilty that they've reached their particular state of illness through their own fault, perhaps feel very unworthy, but are in so much need of forgiveness. Forgiveness of themselves, maybe forgiveness for others. Are they like the Gerasene demoniac, toward whom some do not recognize as a person? Are they like the Gerasene demoniac who shuns others, even God himself, but once encountered by Christ is healed, restored to a right relationship with others, is freed from the demons, and clothed with proper dignity? And in and through the encounter is now a witness of God's awesomeness to others. In medicine, which as we know is among the most prominent of professions, we are in a position to uphold the truth of about who man is. We are in a position to monitor, so to speak, how patients especially are treated with respect to their dignity as persons, and to recognize that when such respect is diminished or absent, we take corrective action. And we're in a position to defend against views and actions, policies and procedures that assail the dignity of the human person. In many ways, we are on the front line of these assaults to human dignity. This point is a lecture unto itself. Indeed, an entire symposium can be devoted to this and still only go so far. But from my meager practice experience, I simply wish to offer a few points concerning practice with a proper accord to the dignity and respect for patients. I think we need to be very careful, first off, about a utilitarian ethic that pervades our culture these days. This, I find, is very insidious in medicine today, especially, it seems, with greater economic and financial pressures being imposed upon medical practice. There are many ways, most I think are quite simple, as to how in our daily practice we can demonstrate and uphold personal respect, especially for our patients. And doing so helps us to appreciate the virtue of our profession. One way that has occurred to me over the past few years is not double booking patients for office visits. You know, I didn't think much of this in the past. Certainly this sort of thing is done in other industries, so to speak. But in the context of medical practice and the fiduciary relationship we ought to maintain with our patients, I cannot see how double booking appointments can be an ethical practice and be respectful to our patients. Another way of exhibiting virtue in one's medical practice is rather simple also, but sometimes very easy to miss. And that has to do with how we refer to patients when we are conversing with our colleagues. We know that we should refer to patients as the person with diabetes, the person with angioedema, not the diagnosis, not the overdose in room 204 or the pneumonia in 227. Further, in our dialogue, we ought to personalize patients, refer to them in the context of the relationship, mom or dad, brother or sister, son or daughter. Along the same lines of personalization of patients, I would urge that we avoid using the term vegetative. Instead of saying persistent vegetative state, say state of minimal consciousness. Now, I know persistent vegetative state is deeply ingrained in medical textbooks and literature and so on. But in some areas, it seems to be shifting, I think, by thoughtful authors in medicine, and I offer that for your consideration. The patient is always a person. Recently, with a class of first-year medical students, them having just completed gross anatomy, we were discussing their experience with their human cadaver, and I was very pleased to hear them referring to their cadaver as their first patient and what that person taught them. They intuitively knew of personhood and were respectful of the body of that, their first patient person. It is so critical in our profession to maintain the primacy of the patient as person. Here's another passage from my co-presenter. What might this teach us? Then Jesus went with them to a place called Gethsemane. And he said to his disciples, "Sit here while I go over there and pray." And taking with him Peter and the two sons of Zebedee, he began to be sorrowful and troubled. Then he said to them, "My soul is very sorrowful, even to death. Remain here and watch with me." And going a little farther, he fell on his face and prayed, "My Father, if it be possible, let this chalice pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will. And he came to the disciples and found them sleeping. And he said to Peter, So, could you not watch with me 1 hour? Watch and pray that you may not enter into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak. Again, for the second time, he went away and prayed, My Father, if this cannot pass unless I drink it, your will be done. And again he came and found them sleeping, for their eyes were heavy. So leaving them again, he went away and prayed for the third time, saying the same words. Then he came to the disciples and said to them, Are you still sleeping and taking your rest? Behold, the hour is at hand, and the Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand. One lesson that strikes me from this account is about being present to others, and in our profession, present to our patients. It's a beautiful witness by Dr. Solmesi the other day, just about that, wasn't it? Presence for his patient. How important this is, especially when we can think of 101 reasons not to be, and especially for that complex patient who we feel we have nothing to offer. You know, we trained in sleep medicine will talk about sleep pressure, that biological urge to sleep. And we all know from personal experience that sleep pressure can be very strong. For Peter, James, and John in the Garden of Gethsemane, it must have been quite intense. This is a great challenge for me. Sometimes I find it very easy to be present to patients and their families. Other times, I must admit, I am sound asleep. Living and practicing in light of the gospel, though, is a process of becoming. Sometimes we've arrived and we're on the right mark, and we can even imagine hearing the King say, Come, O blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you. But at other times, in other circumstances, we're not even sure if we're moving at all, nor do we even know where we are going. One way of being present is to give patients easy access to your email or your work phone number in a way that they know if and when they need you, they will be able to reach you, that you'll be there for them. Now, I know we must be careful in terms of maintaining professionalism, boundaries, and so on, but I do think there are many times for selected patients for whom you deem will respect your privacy, easier access can be made. Those patients want to know that in their time of serious need, you are present and not asleep. Remember, in those times, they are Jesus. Do we want to be sleeping like Peter, James, and John? At this point, I would like to share a few comments about evangelization as it relates to practicing in light of the gospel. After all, the word gospel in Greek, euangelion, or in Latin, evangelium, is the same root word, of course, for our word evangelization. To announce and make known the good news, to live the good news. So finding joy in practicing in light of the gospel and sharing that joy of the gospel with patients. So how might we do that? Well, again, from my personal experience and very well aware, recognizing that you all, of course, have your own, I want to share some simple thoughts, maybe some practical points that you may find helpful. Many times in patient encounters, we may have the opportunity to inject what I call God phrases into conversation with patients. For example, when a patient is telling me about their family member who is not well, or they are telling me maybe about a joyful event like the birth of a baby or a parent who just turned 97 years old, I might say simply something like, God bless them. And that may open a door for some further conversation along the lines of God and faith. Or patients often, very often ask me, or the families many times, in so many words, how long do they have to live? And my response, very simply, many times I'll say, there is only one person who knows how long any of us will live. Of course, referring to God. And this many times brings comfort to them and leads again to some expression of faith on their part, certainly my part, depending on the circumstance and the dynamic with that patient or the patient's family. Or one patient recently telling me about her God, and before I let her go on, I said in a gentle, agreeing way, there's only one God. And she smiled broadly and said, oh, I see you believe like me. Again, opens a door. Or sometimes I'll say to a patient, many times actually, I'll keep you in my prayers, or I'll keep them in my prayers. Now, not only are these phrases okay to say, but we need to say them when it is appropriate. We can't be completely private with our faith, and certainly we must not be silent about our faith. The good news is to be shared. The good news about God who is personal and relational and loves us and wants to enter into our woundedness. We need to convey this to our patients, especially as we noted in the beginning, that we are the ones who most commonly and prominently confront the woundedness of others. Here's another one. Now, when Jesus came, he found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb 4 days. Bethany was near Jerusalem, about 2 miles off. And many of the Jews had come to Martha and Mary to console them concerning their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went and met him, while Mary sat in the house. Martha said to Jesus, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. And even now I know that whatever you ask from God, God will give you. And Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. And Martha said, I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day. Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live, and whoever lives and believes in me shall never die. Do you believe this? She said to him, yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, he who is coming into the world. This beautiful account of Jesus at the tomb of his friend Lazarus is the setting for one of the most hopeful lines in the Gospels. I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live. And whoever lives and believes in me shall never die. I cannot help but recall and meditate on this at every wake service or funeral mass or memorial service that I attend. And as a physician, many times encountering patients and their families at the moment of death and during the process of dying, this particular I am saying of Jesus is being repeated over and over in my thoughts. I often find joy and peacefulness at work as I try to see things in the context of biblical images. I've tried to share that with you, and I think that if we can develop a sensitivity to see God in our midst, His Word among us in our day-to-day activity, then I think we will enhance compassionate sensitivity toward our patients. We will enjoy a greater sense of true compassion, a suffering with them and with their family. One concrete expression of this may be in our attending the funeral services for our patients when possible. Many of you may already do this and do this regularly. Along similar lines, calling a patient's family after the death of a patient beyond the mere notification of death, which we sometimes, of course, need to do. Many of you already do this, but if not, and if it makes sense and resonates with you, then consider it. As the title of this meeting reminds us, medicine is a virtuous profession. One of the reasons for this is that in our profession, we have so many opportunities to develop and apply the many virtues, behaviors that lead us to see the divine in our work, and in recognizing Him, experience joy and bring that joy to others. Privileged as we are to encounter Jesus and to practice in accord with gospel values, we are prompted by the Holy Spirit, alive in us and alive in the church, to step out and share the joy of the gospel. Reflecting as I do on the nature of what it means to be a Catholic physician and how to conceptualize two dimensions of our life, that is, our professional lives as physicians and our personal faith lives, I propose this view, that we strive to be Catholic physicians, not just physicians who are Catholic. As Catholic physicians, we are especially privileged because of the opportunities to see Jesus in the woundedness of others, to contemplate the mystery of suffering, to do our best to uphold and safeguard the dignity of the human person, to experience joy in the midst of our encounters with patients, and to share that with them, helping them to see the joy found in the crucified and risen Jesus Christ. As Catholic physicians who, like all Catholics, are privileged to participate in a rich sacramental life and receive the abundant outpouring of grace through the sacraments, especially in the Eucharist and at the confessional, can prominently practice living those great virtues of faith, hope, and love. Sharing our faith, providing hope, and always acting in love in all that we do. Mindful of these opportunities and the virtues to which we are called to cultivate in our lives, especially also those of humility and compassion, we clearly recognize medicine as the truly virtuous profession that it is. I wish to close with these words from our Holy Father. Before all else, the gospel invites us to respond to the God of love who saves us, to see God in others, and to go forth from ourselves to seek the good of others. Under no circumstances can this invitation be obscured. All of the virtues are at the service of this response to love. Thank you.